If you've ever played Animal Crossing, you've probably noticed your villagers doing different activities during your playtime. At one point in the day, they're outside walking around, but later on that day, you find them at home. I know these NPCs are here to help entertain us while we play, but I've always wondered, how does a villager spend a full 24-hour day on the island? This is Marshall, and this is Marshall's house at 4:58 a.m. In Animal Crossing, the cycle of a new day begins at 5 a.m., so I wanted to make sure to be right outside Marshall's house right when the day resets to begin our experiment. Breaking news. This just in, it turns out Marshall the squirrel doesn't wake up at 5 a.m. This is because his personality is smug, and it's something I forgot to remember when picking him for this video. Villagers in Animal Crossing can have one of 4 personality types depending on if they're male or female, and for smug villagers, they're all programmed to wake up at 7 a.m. So naturally, I spent 2 real hours of my morning to see if something different would happen. Surprise! He woke up at 7 a.m. Marshall opened up his window curtain, which was my cue to barge in. He started off the day as anyone else would by asking me for a fish that had been staying warm inside my pockets to be his new pet. Afterwards, I settled in to observe his morning routine. Now, I've always just assumed that the NPCs in this game were programmed to change what they were doing every new hour. With this in mind, I waited inside Marshall's house for another hour until 8 a.m. When the new hour started, nothing really happened. So I decided to talk to him to potentially trigger a response, but again, nothing. After learning this, I decided to experiment with a new test, manually changing the clock myself. On the Nintendo Switch, you can desync your clock from real time and adjust it to any time you'd like. Since Animal Crossing reacts to your console's internal clock, I'm able to change the time to whenever I want. For the sake of getting an authentic day in the life of a villager, I didn't want to do this right away for the video. But after essentially standing still for 3 real-life hours of my morning, I decided now was the time to try moving the clock manually. After some time traveling, I went back to Marshall's and he was still inside. I moved the clock forward again to 10 a.m. and while he was still inside after I returned, this time he had a visitor. I was starting to wonder that maybe because I saved the game while he was inside, the game loaded him back inside after manually adjusting the clock. So rather than time traveling, I wanted to see if I could come up with something to make him leave the house organically. I ran around my island as if I was normally playing, walking in and out of different buildings to maybe give the game a chance to load Marshall in a different location. After about 5 minutes, I returned to find him still inside. I time traveled again from about 10:05 to 10:57, right before the new hour started. Assuming the game would keep him inside before 11 a.m. hit, I started up the game and to my surprise, he was outside. I figured he would have still been inside based on previous moments time traveling, so this made me feel like I still knew too little about how villagers were programmed. The good news is that now that he's outside, the real fun can begin as we can now study exactly how a villager moves around outdoors. At this point, Marshall began doing some standard things you'd expect for a computer living in this world to do. He walked around, sat by a tree, watered some flowers. Code red. Do you see this? This squirrel should not be watering flowers. A small detail in Animal Crossing that people may not know about is the fact that villagers can have hobbies. Villagers are assigned different hobbies and are often seen doing these around the island to occupy their time. Aside from general hobbies such as walking around or sitting, some specific hobbies are reading, gardening, and more. Marshall's hobby is music and dancing, which is why it threw me off to see him doing some gardening. I learned more about hobbies later in this video, so we'll come back to that. For now, let's just see what Marshall does. I continued following him around until it was almost noon, and again wanted to see if he would be programmed to go anywhere at the new hour. At this point, I still clinched to the idea that something would happen when a new hour began, especially because we were outside. When 12 o'clock hit, everything seemed to remain the same, but I noticed we were starting to move to a new part of the island. At our new location, Marshall started fishing, got distracted by a bug, fished some more, and then took a nap. Some other activities happened for another half hour until we made it to 1 p.m. This was an exciting hour because this means we were officially 1/3 done with the day. Although this was just the beginning part of my day with Marshall, I felt I had learned a lot already despite thinking I knew so much. Little did I know, more confusion was on the horizon. While we watch Marshall enjoy my decorating, I'd like to take this moment to remind you all to subscribe and like the video if you made it this far. For every person that leaves a comment below and lets me know that they subscribed, I'll catch a fish for you. For the next 20 minutes, Marshall hung out in what was my most abandoned and neglected part of my island. This area probably has the least amount of foot travel through it, so it was nice to see a villager naturally walking up here and enjoy some of my older decorations. During the rest of the hour, Marshall slowly began making his way up to the front of my island. Right before 2 p.m., I got ready to anticipate a programmed walk cycle, but guess what? Nothing happened. Marshall stayed right where he was. It was at this point I felt like something was really off. In all the hours of playing this game, I have definitely felt some things were programmed for villagers to do at the beginning of new hours. I tried to trigger some movement from Marshall by leaving my island in numerous ways instead of just saving and quitting the game. I left through the airport for a few minutes to visit Harv. This area is loaded separately from my island, so I figured it was a clever way to force the game to randomly load my villagers back home upon returning. But when coming back, the game kept all of my villagers in the same spot. I then traveled with Cap'n by going on a special boat tour, which again, loads a brand new island on the screen. Hoping this would maybe randomize some movement for my villagers, I returned home after about 5 minutes and Marshal was still in the same spot. It was time to not only study Marshal, but to study the movements of other villagers on my island as well. At 2:15, Marshal started to dance. This makes sense because again, that's supposed to be his hobby. I let him be and turned my focus to find the villager who was inside crafting an item for me. I had a vague memory of once hearing that at all points during your playtime in this game, a villager must be inside crafting a recipe for you to discover. At this time, it was Lolly. After making a mental note of where my villagers were at this point, I stood outside Lolly's house for the remainder of the hour. I wanted to see if at the start of a new hour, Lolly would automatically stop crafting. But when it finally became 3, I found Marshal still singing and Lolly still inside crafting. I went to the internet to clear any suspicions about when villagers stop and start crafting and found out that during the course of a day, there are 3 instances where a villager can be found inside crafting. This means we have found 1 of the 3 so far, as long as no other villagers were crafting earlier this morning. I ran around my island for 10 minutes or so to study what everyone was doing before starting another reset. This reset wasn't to start a new hour, but instead to see if quitting out of the game causes all the villagers to move around. We know from earlier in the video that when changing the clock to nearly an hour in the future changed Marshal's location, but what about the others? I reloaded the game and now found that Tangy was crafting, even though it wasn't a new hour just yet. Moving forward to 4 PM, Marshal is now MIA. We'll find him again soon, but I wanted to shift my focus to Tangy and this whole crafting thing now. I arrived at Tangy's and found out she was still crafting during the new hour change. While it started to settle in that my previous assumption of new hours changing my villagers' activities was in fact wrong, I did learn that something does change. The villagers' outfits will be randomized every time you quit and load back in, assuming you have gifted them some new clothes already. At least one new fact has been learned. As we approach the 12-hour mark, I wanted to give a quick recap on Marshal's day. So far, Marshal has spent 2 hours sleeping in, 4 hours of his morning inside, part of that hanging with a friend, and 5 hours outside doing various activities before heading to the museum. I'd say it's been a pretty solid day so far. Moving forward another 10 minutes from Marshal's current museum location, Lolly could now be found inside. Another 10 minutes forward and Tangy was inside crafting still, but this time in a new outfit. Fact confirmed. Marshal still remained inside the museum as I saved and moved forward to 5:02, the beginning of a new hour. Lolly could now be found outside, Bob was inside his house, Tangy was starting hour 2 on crafting while Marshal was nowhere to be found. I returned to the museum to find Genji the bunny at the art museum. Speaking of Genji, I also found him gardening the same spot Marshal was earlier, which answers my question of Marshal's hobby being messed up. I believe this animation of spraying the hedges doesn't count as the gardening hobby, and instead is another random activity any villager can be found doing. I continued walking through the museum, and surprise, Marshal appeared here again. But this instance was super strange this time because I had just checked the room prior to where he was and no one was there at all. I even replayed back the footage to make sure I wasn't crazy, and yeah, turns out he just randomly appeared after walking in the room again. I saved and moved forward to 6 PM and found Tangy had now been crafting for 3 hours total and again had on a different outfit. With her starting hour 3 of her crafting and having 11 hours left of the day, this meant there should be at least one more villager who could be found inside crafting according to the information we found earlier. Checking the museum again, Marshal was still here, but maybe Marshal just happened to be a scripted villager when me, the player, is forced to see while viewing the museum collection. I ran around to different rooms to see if the game would force him to appear in any other section of the museum, but surprisingly, the game kept him in the same exact spot. I time traveled from 6:30 to 7:30, and guess what? Tangy was no longer crafting. I found Tangy and Freya outside, while Azalea was found inside as the new crafting villager. I found Marshal still in the museum, which marked almost 4 hours spent inside this one building. An hour later at 8:30, Tangy, Freya, and Azalea remained in the same exact spot. I ran back to the museum and checked every room thinking Marshal would still be here, but to my surprise, he was back at the plaza singing. Another hour later, around 9:30, Azalea could no longer be found cooking, officially confirming 3 villagers crafting in a single day. This new hour also meant that we were 2/3 of the way done with this challenge. While looking for Marshal, I checked his house, Nook's Cranny, and the Able Sisters, but for whatever reason, he was back at the fossil section in the museum. I saved the game and moved forward, expecting him to stay here for the rest of the night. At the 10:45 mark, the Able Sisters store was now closed and Freya was still outside. At 10:55, Marshal was still in the museum like I expected. I moved forward to 11:55 to wait and see what would happen at midnight. I'd been wrong about every instance of villagers being programmed to do something at the start of the new hour, but surely a new day meant villagers would do something, right? At 11:58, I found Marshal outside the museum and waited for the clock to strike midnight. When the clock rang, Marshall continued to just wander around. I followed him around for a couple minutes, but he basically remained still. I traveled again to 1258 and found Marshall had gone inside. While inside, a cool detail I learned while hanging with him was that you can actually hear the chewing and swallowing of food the villagers are eating. Small details like that are super interesting to me. I always just thought it was a random animation, but it's kind of nice that they added, the chewing and swallowing sounds. Anyways, I mentioned earlier in this video that smug villagers were programmed to wake up at 7 a.m., but forgot to mention when they sleep. Marshall should be programmed to sleep at 2 a.m., which meant I had 1 more hour with him until my observing hours ended. Despite him having to sleep in an hour, Marshall actually made an espresso around 1 a.m. I left his house to find some other villagers had gone to bed. Moving forward to 1:56 a.m., right before Marshall was supposed to sleep, I explored to see if anything else was going on around the island at this hour. I've never really played this late before, so it was fun to hear music from this hour and take in the atmosphere of this time. I returned to Marshall's house at 1:59, and while he was outside, the clock striking 2 a.m. meant he had to walk back to his home to begin his sleep cycle. I ran around for about 5 minutes after 2 a.m. hit, and he was nowhere to be found. There's no way he's at the museum, right? Marshall was back at the museum. I interacted with him and wondered if I left, would he teleport back home? Turns out he stayed at the museum. I finally found him outside after moving forward to 2:59. The only explanation that I could come up with as to why he was still wandering around outside was because the game must keep villagers outside even at these hours to have some sort of interaction while someone is playing at this hour. But when 3 o'clock hit, something amazing happened. He turned. Coincidence? Is he actually going home? Am I finally going to be right about something before this video ends? This is one thing I thought would happen. Follow a villager at a scripted moment at a certain hour. That's it. Finally, a scripted event happened at the beginning of a new hour. At 3 a.m., Marshall immediately turned around and started walking back home. I even tried to disrupt it by talking to him, but he still remained focused on his programming to get inside. I moved the clock forward to 4 a.m., and at this point, 1 hour remained in the full 24-hour day. I walked around and found only Rold was outside and confirmed everyone else was asleep. I moved to 4:58 and spent my last couple minutes of this experiment with Rold. A cool thing that happened this time at 5 a.m. that I didn't notice earlier in the video was that I couldn't find a single normal villager walking around. The only one who was awake at this time was Lolly. And technically Lolly is programmed to wake up at 6 a.m. as she's a normal type villager, but again, I think this game forces someone to be awake so that the player has someone to interact with. But with that, the 24 hours were done and we can finally answer the title of this video. What does a villager do during a 24-hour day? I can't say for certain what happens on every other day of the year, but Marshall the squirrel spent a single day in November doing the following: 4 hours sleeping, 5 hours inside, 8.5 hours outside, and 6.5 hours at the museum, mostly at the fossil section. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you for watching.